In order to understand why everybody is on a pilgrimage to Canterbury in Kent, I thought we would take a quick look at Thomas à Becket, the saint who died there. So I'm going to stop here and give a little background about King Henry II, who, by the way, was born in France, lived most of his life in France, and died in France, but he was King of England. And Thomas à Becket, who was from London, his name originally was Thomas of London. It was later changed to Thomas à Becket. But anyway, he was born of a merchant, and he was a very affable guy, and he was strong and handsome and young and charming, and he and King Henry became fast friends. And, they caroused together, had a good time, and later King Henry II had a son named Henry, and they called him Henry the Younger, or Young Henry, and he sent him to Thomas's home to foster, which was a common practice back then with the elite. But I'll tell you this in order to show you that King Henry II and Thomas à Becket, had a really close relationship. In fact, King Henry appointed Thomas à Becket Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162. And you would want to say, why appoint somebody like that as the Archbishop? Well, Henry thought that Thomas would put the royal government before the church. The church were then over the English clergymen. This went back to the times of William of Normandy. If you remember my reminding you to remember that date, 1066, when William the Conqueror conquered England. So William the Conqueror had allowed the church jurisdiction over certain cases, particularly those of marriage and certain kinds of people, namely any one of the clerical orders, religious clerical orders. In practice, clerks accused of really serious crimes would first be stripped of their clerical status in the church courts and then handed over to the royal courts. But this was merely a custom and not a law, and Henry wanted this practice set to law, which brought him into opposition with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas à Becket. So Thomas Becket felt that religious clerks, whenever they got in trouble with the law, should be judged by the church and not the secular courts. And so he kind of resisted this. So then Henry produced the Constitution of Clarendon, which he was trying to formalize this and make this a law that the clerks would submit to the secular courts and not the religious courts. But wherever the rights and privileges of the Church of Canterbury were threatened by the king in any way, Thomas à Becket would fight back. From that point on, Thomas and Henry would not stop provoking each other. Little disputes got magnified, all out of proportion. Finally, the king decided to bring Becket down for good and accused him of embezzlement during his days as chancellor. It's likely it was a bogus charge, but anyway, the charge was serious enough that Becket fled to the continent and would be gone 6 years before he returned to England. Henry and Thomas reached a compromise in 1170, and Thomas was allowed to return to England. The thing that set everything into motion that resulted in Thomas Becket's death is King Henry, who wanted his son, Henry the Young King, or Young Henry, he wanted him crowned in England so that when King Henry II passed away, his son would ascend the throne smoothly. And this was something that was a privilege for the Canterbury Church. And instead, King Henry II had his son crowned by the Archbishop of York, the Bishop of London, and the Bishop of Salisbury. So this breached Canterbury privilege of coronation. Becket, pretty upset at the slight, excommunicated all 3 bishops. And the 3 bishops in turn went to Normandy and told King Henry II. By the way, the artwork on these slides, they reflect the events of which we've been speaking. Here's the kicker. When King Henry II heard the news that Thomas had excommunicated the 3 bishops, he made this offhand comment. He said, "Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest?" Turns out some people took him seriously. So on December 29th, 1170, the 3 knights that heard King Henry make the offhand comment, arrived in Canterbury. They took the comment as an order, and they hid their swords under a tree, and they hid their shield and chainmail under their clothing, and they went into the church. And they asked Becket to submit to the king's will. And Becket, by the way, was given a service. He's doing what, bishops do. He's doing his religious work and holding a religious service. And Becket says no. Becket says he's willing to die for what he believes in. So the knights went back out. They grabbed their swords and they came back in. And the other priests and bishops wanted to keep the doors locked, but Thomas said, "No, let them in," because he said, "I'm willing to die for what I believe in." So they let the 3 knights in, and they do exactly what's depicted here in this piece of artwork. They hit him over the head with swords, so that his bishop crown flies off. Pieces of brain, a milky white substance, mixed with the blood of his wound on the floor. Is quite a horrific tale. So after Thomas dies and they're preparing him for his burial, they remove his clothes and discover that he's wearing a hair shirt for penance. This was something that you saw a lot of religious monks do back then. It's called flagellation. Sometimes they would whip their backs with a cat o' nine tails with little pieces of metal in the end to rip their skin. Anything to make themselves suffer for Christ in order to, I guess, greater earn their forgiveness, or to illustrate how serious they are in wanting penance and receiving forgiveness. So he's wearing this hair shirt. 2 years later, Pope Alexander II canonizes Thomas Becket, February of 1173. Henry then he realizes he needs to publicly show that he is remorseful, so he kind of makes a pilgrimage there and humbles himself and seeks penance for the killing of Thomas Becket. The knights that killed him, there were 3 knights, and the knights that killed Thomas Becket, their punishment was they had to serve penance in the Holy Land. I believe it was 14 years they had to serve penance. I should probably add, for those who might not know, the Holy Land reference is Israel, Jerusalem. So to go to the Holy Land is to go to Jerusalem. Okay, so we mentioned a hair shirt that Thomas Becket was wearing. I wanted to just show you what one looked like. Right here on the right, and there's a really old one just above there that's framed. And you can imagine, I've never worn a hair shirt, but you can imagine how miserable that would be to wear that under your clothing up against your bare skin, scratching and itching you all day long. Must have been pretty miserable. And again, someone would wear that in order to illustrate their seriousness for forgiveness. And since then, it's become a euphemism of maybe somebody who enjoys suffering. They might, the analogy would be that they are wearing their hair shirt. So Thomas Becket's grave was moved a few years after his death from Canterbury to Trinity Chapel, and the photo on the left is a photo of his burial site.